In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Hall, a glass shatters, a scream echoes, and a deadly poison strikes. Who slipped arsenic into Clara Ashbourne's wine? Was it her brooding husband, haunted by debts? Her defiant daughter, burning with secrets? Or the trusted doctor, hiding the past too dark to face? As whispers of a lost law and a hidden letter surface, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of betrayal where every clue conceals a lie. Can she pierce the darkness before another life is lost? Step into this chilling mystery, where truth is the deadliest poison of all. Chapter 1. The gathering at Blackthorn Hall. The late summer sun casts a golden haze over the rolling lawns of Blackthorn Hall, a sprawling Georgian manor nestled in the heart of the English countryside. Its ivy-clad walls and towering chimneys spoke of old money and older secrets, the kind that clung to the air like damp mist. The village of Thornby, a mere mile away, buzzed with whispers about the weekend's gathering at the Hall, a reunion of the Ashbourne family, orchestrated by the formidable Lady Beatrice Ashbourne. To the villagers, it was a spectacle of wealth and intrigue. To Miss Jane Marple, who sat quietly in her cottage in nearby street, Mead, it was a matter of mild curiosity until, that is, the letter arrived. Miss Marple's sitting room was a study in understated comfort, chintz curtains, a well-worn armchair, and a tea tray set with precision. She adjusted her spectacles and unfolded the letter, written in the elegant, looping hand of her old friend, Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, Lady Beatrice's cousin and a frequent visitor to Street Mary Mead. The letter was an invitation, though it carried an undertone of urgency that piqued Miss Marple's interest. My dear Jane, it began, I find myself at Blackthorn Hall for Beatrice's gathering, and I confess, the atmosphere is rather strained. Old wounds, you know, and new ones forming. I should feel so much better if you were here. Your quiet way of seeing things has a knack of setting matters right. Do come, if you can manage it. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled as she folded the letter. Eleanor was not prone to exaggeration, and the phrase old wounds suggested a history worth observing. She rang for her maid, Dolly, and requested her small suitcase be prepared. By the afternoon, she was on the train to Thornby, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the Ashbourne family. Blackthorn Hall was abuzz when Miss Marple arrived, her modest hat and neat woolen coat a stark contrast to the grandeur of the entrance hall. Eleanor Grayson greeted her warmly, her face lined with worry beneath a practiced smile. Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you come. It's all rather complicated. Complicated, my dear Eleanor. It's often just a matter of untangling the threads, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. She patted Eleanor's hand and surveyed the room. The Ashbourne family and their guests were gathered for tea, their voices a low hum of polite tension. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne, a stately woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and a commanding presence, presided over the group. Her son, Reginald Ashbourne, a handsome man of 40 with a restless air, lounged by the fireplace, his eyes darting to his wife, Clara, a pale beauty who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Their daughter, Lydia, a sharp-featured girl of 20, toyed with a silver teaspoon, her expression sullen. Beside her sat Dr. Henry Whittaker, the family physician, a man of middle age with a quiet demeanor and watchful eyes. Then there was Captain Marcus Trent, a retired naval officer and Beatrice's brother-in-law, whose hearty laugh masked a certain hardness. Finally, Miss Violet Harrell, Beatrice's ward, a nervous young woman with a habit of twisting her handkerchief, completed the circle. Miss Marple settled into a corner, her knitting in her lap, and observed. The conversation was polite, too polite, she thought, like the surface of a pond hiding turbulent currents below. Reginald spoke of estate matters with forced enthusiasm, while Clara murmured vague agreements. Lydia's sharp retorts to her father suggested a simmering resentment, and Violet's anxious glances toward Beatrice hinted at unspoken fears. Dr. Whittaker, meanwhile, listened more than he spoke, his fingers drumming lightly on a teacup. Only Captain Trent seemed at ease, regaling the group with tales of his naval days, though Miss Marple noted his eyes lingered too long on Clara. As tea concluded, Lady Beatrice rose, her voice cutting through the chatter. We shall dine at 8, and I expect everyone to be prompt. This weekend is about unity, and I will not tolerate discord. Her gaze swept the room, lingering on Reginald and Lydia. Miss Marple caught the flicker of defiance in Lydia's eyes and the tightening of Clara's lips. Unity, it seemed, was a fragile hope. Dinner was a grand affair, served in the oak-paneled dining room beneath a chandelier that glittered like a frozen waterfall. Miss Marple, seated between Eleanor and Dr. Whittaker, noted the careful arrangement. Beatrice at the head, Reginald and Clara to her right, Lydia and Violet to her left, and Captain Trent at the foot. The meal roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and the delicate consommé was impeccable, yet the atmosphere was heavy. Conversation faltered, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the occasional strained laugh. It was during the dessert course, a rich chocolate torte, that the first crack appeared. Clara, who had been unusually silent, suddenly clutched her throat, her face paling. "I feel unwell," she gasped, her wineglass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Dr. Whittaker was at her side in an instant, his calm professionalism a contrast to the rising panic in the room. "Clara, what is it?" Reginald demanded, his voice sharp with fear or something else Miss Marple could not yet tell. "It's nothing, surely," Beatrice said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Henry, see to her." Dr. Whittaker helped Clara to a chair, loosening her collar. "Breathe slowly, Mrs. Ashbourne. Have you eaten anything unusual?" Clara shook her head weakly, her eyes wide with fright. "Just the meal. The one, perhaps." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. "The one." She noted the half-empty glass, its contents now mingling with the shards on the floor. Dr. Whittaker administered a mild sedative, and Clara was escorted to her room, the dinner party dissolving into uneasy murmurs. Later, in the drawing room, Miss Marple sat with Eleanor, her knitting resumed. "Tell me, Eleanor," she said softly, "what are these old wounds you mentioned?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the door. "Beatrice's husband, Sir Charles, died 10 years ago, heart failure, they said, but there were rumors of poison. Nothing was proven, but it left a shadow. Reginald inherited the estate, but he's been reckless with money. Clara's delicate health has strained their marriage, and Lydia, well, she's never forgiven her father for certain choices. Then there's Violet, who came to Beatrice after her parents' death. Some say she knows more about Sir Charles than she lets on." "And Captain Trent?" Miss Marple prompted, "a charmer, but unreliable. He's been borrowing from Beatrice for years. And Dr. Whittaker, well, he's devoted to the family, but I've seen him watching Clara rather too closely." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. A family bound by obligation, resentment, and secrets. A spilled glass of wine. A woman's sudden illness. It was, she thought, like the beginning of one of her village stories, where the smallest gesture, a glance, a word could unravel everything. As the clock struck 10, a scream pierced the quiet. It came from upstairs, high and sharp, followed by a thud. The guests froze, then surged toward the staircase, Miss Marple following at her own steady pace. In Clara's bedroom, they found her lying on the floor, her face ashen, her breathing shallow. Dr. Whittaker knelt beside her, his expression grim. "She's been poisoned," he said quietly, holding up an empty vial that had rolled under the bed. "Arsenic, I wager." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene, the open window, the scattered bedclothes, the faint scent of bitter almonds in the air. The threads were beginning to form a pattern, but it was not yet clear. One thing, however, was certain. Blackthorn Hall was no longer a place of polite gatherings. It was a stage for murder. Chapter 2. The shadow of death. The air in Clara Ashbourne's bedroom was thick with shock and the faint, acrid scent of arsenic. The guests crowded near the doorway, their faces a tableau of horror, suspicion, and, in some cases, Miss Marple noted, a flicker of something less readable, relief, perhaps, or calculation. She stood quietly to one side, her small frame almost invisible amid the chaos, her knitting folded neatly in her hands. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. The way Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, the nervous twist of Violet Harrow's handkerchief, the quick glance Captain Trent shot toward Reginald. It was, she thought, like watching a village quarrel unfold, where every gesture betrayed a deeper truth. "Dear," Henry Whittaker remained kneeling beside Clara, his fingers pressed to her wrist, his face a mask of professional calm. "She's alive," he announced, his voice steady but grave. "But only just. We must get her to a hospital at once. The poison has taken hold, but there's a chance if we act quickly." Reginald Ashbourne, his face pale and his hands trembling, pushed forward. "Poison? How could this happen? Clara was fine at dinner, wasn't she?" His voice cracked, and Miss Marple observed the way his eyes darted to the shattered wineglass on the floor downstairs. "Now forgotten in the rush to Clara's room, Reginald. Pull yourself together," Lady Beatrice snapped, her tone cutting through the room like a whip. "Henry, what do you need?" "An ambulance, immediately," Dacre Whittaker replied. "And someone must telephone the police. This is no accident." Captain Trent, who had been lingering near the window, cleared his throat. "I'll make the call," he said, his hearty demeanor subdued. He strode out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Miss Marple stepped closer to the bed, her gaze sweeping the scene. The vial Dr. Whittaker had found was small, clear glass, unstoppered, and bore no label. It lay near the bedpost, as if dropped in haste. The bedclothes were in disarray, suggesting a struggle or sudden collapse. The window, slightly ajar, let in a cool breeze that stirred the curtains. She noted the nightstand, the glass of water, half drunk, a novel with a bookmark, and a small silver locket, its chain tangled. Something about the locket caught her attention. It was open, revealing a tiny photograph, too small to discern from where she stood. "Poor Clara," Violet Harrell whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched her handkerchief so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Who would do such a thing?" Lydia Ashbourne, standing rigidly by the door, let out a bitter laugh. "Who wouldn't? This family is a nest of vipers." Her words were sharp, but her eyes were red-rimmed, betraying a grief she refused to voice. "Lydia, that's enough," Beatrice said coldly. "This is no time for your theatrics." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild but her mind racing. Lydia's outburst was revealing not for its content, but for its timing. Grief, she knew, could loosen tongues, but so could guilt. She made a mental note to speak with Lydia later, perhaps over a cup of tea, where confidences often flow more freely. Eleanor Grayson, hovering near Miss Marple, whispered, "Jane, this is dreadful. Clara was so frail already. Do you think, could it have been meant for someone else?" "A good question, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied softly. "Poison is a curious weapon, personal, deliberate. It requires knowledge of the victim's habits. We must consider who knew Clara's routines best. The ambulance arrived within the hour, its siren cutting through the stillness of the countryside night. Clara was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, her breathing shallow but steady, thanks to Dr. Whittaker's quick administration of a neutralizing agent. As the medics carried her out, the household stood in the entrance hall, a silent, uneasy group. Miss Marple noted the time, 10:47 p.m., according to the grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner. The police arrived shortly after, led by Inspector Crawley, a stout man with a weary air and a notebook already in hand. He was, Miss Marple thought, competent but uninspired, the sort who relied on procedure rather than insight. He questioned the household briefly, establishing the timeline. Dinner had begun at 8 p.m. Clara's first symptoms appeared at 9:15 p.m., and the scream was heard at 10 p.m., he declared, would be sent for analysis. Though he confirmed Dr. Whittaker's suspicion of arsenic, someone in this house had access to poison, Inspector Crawley said, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the group. And motive, no doubt. I'll need statements from everyone. No one leaves Blackthorn whole until we've sorted this out. Lady Beatrice drew herself up, her voice icy. Inspector, this is a respectable family. I assure you, we will cooperate fully, but I expect discretion. Discretion, my lady, depends on the truth, Crawley replied bluntly. He turned to Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from a corner. And you, madam? A guest, I presume. Jane Marple, she said with a small smile. A friend of Mrs. Grayson's. I'm merely visiting, Inspector, but I'm happy to assist if I can. Crawley grunted, clearly unimpressed. Very well. Stay out of the way, if you please. Miss Marple nodded demurely, but her mind was already at work. The inspector's focus on the vial was understandable, but she suspected the real clues lay elsewhere in the locket, perhaps, or the wineglass, or the fleeting expression she had caught during dinner. She recalled a case in Street Mary Mead, where a young woman's poisoning had been traced to a seemingly innocent jar of preserves. The key had been a conversation overheard in the village shop, a detail no one thought significant. Here, too, the truth would lie in the ordinary, the overlooked. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, where the remnants of dinner still lay. The shattered wineglass had been swept up, but a faint stain marked the rug where it had fallen. She crouched, her knees protesting, and examined the spot. The wine had been red, but Bordeaux, she recalled, served from a single decanter. Had Clara's glass been tampered with? Or was the poison administered later, in her room? Miss Marple, you'll catch a chill down there, dear Whitaker said, appearing at her side. His tone was kind, but his eyes were wary. Oh, I'm quite all right, doctor, she replied, standing with a smile. I was just thinking how careless it is to spill good wine. Tell me, did Clara often take wine with dinner? Occasionally, he said, his expression guarded. She preferred water, given her health. Tonight was an exception. An exception, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How interesting. Duke Whitaker excused himself, and Miss Marple made her way to her guest room, where Eleanor was waiting. Jane, what do you make of it? Eleanor asked, her voice low. It's like something out of a novel. Life, my dear Eleanor, is often stranger than novels, Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. But it follows patterns. In Street Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who poisoned her husband's tea not out of malice, but desperation. The motive here, I suspect, is not so different. We must watch and listen. As Eleanor nodded, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vial. Arsenic was not uncommon. Gardeners used it, as did those with less savory intentions. But its presence in Clara's room suggested intimacy, someone who could enter unnoticed. She resolved to examine the locket in the morning and to speak with Violet, whose nervous demeanor hinted at knowledge she was too frightened to share. Outside, the wind rattled the windows of Blackthorn Hall, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the house's secrets pressing in. A crime had been committed, and the threads of deceit were woven tightly. But Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and sharp eyes, was adept at untangling such knots. The truth, she knew, was already there, waiting to be seen. Chapter 3. The arrival of clarity. The morning after Clara Ashbourne's poisoning dawned grey and heavy, with clouds pressing low over Blackthorn Hall. The house seemed to hold its breath, the grandeur of its high ceilings and polished floors muted by the pall of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, however, was awake early, her small figure wrapped in a shawl as she sat by her bedroom window, her knitting idle for once. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, traced the mist-shrouded gardens below, but her mind was elsewhere, on the locket, the wineglass, and the undercurrents of resentment that rippled through the Ashbourne family. Breakfast was a subdued affair, served in the morning room where long windows overlooked the dew-soaked lawns. Lady Beatrice presided with her usual authority, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Reginald was absent, reportedly tending to business in the study, while Lydia picked at her toast, her expression sullen. Violet Harrow sat hunched, her eyes darting nervously, and Captain Trent attempted to lighten the mood with a forced anecdote about a storm at sea, which fell flat. Duke Whitaker, who had spent the night monitoring Clara's condition via telephone updates from the hospital, reported that she was stable but not yet conscious. Miss Marple, seated beside Eleanor Grayson, sipped her tea and listened. The hospital's report was encouraging, but it raised questions. Arsenic, she knew, could act swiftly or linger, depending on the dose and the victim's constitution. Clara's survival suggested either a small amount or a timely intervention. Dr. Whitaker's quick thinking, perhaps. Yet something in his calm efficiency nagged at her. Like a stitch dropped in a pattern, Inspector Crawley arrived at 9:30, his notebook already open. He gathered the household in the drawing-room, his manner brisk but not unkind. "I've had word from the hospital," he began. "Mrs. Ashbourne is alive, thanks to Dr. Whittaker's efforts, but the poison was indeed arsenic, administered within an hour of her collapse. The vial found in her room confirms it. What I need now are your movements last night, from dinner onward." The questioning began methodically. Lady Beatrice stated she had remained in the dining room after Clara's initial illness, discussing estate matters with Reginald until the scream was heard at 10 p.m. Reginald corroborated this, though his voice was strained, and he admitted to stepping out briefly to fetch a cigar from the library at around 9:30 p.m. Lydia claimed she had gone to her room after dinner, reading until the commotion drew her out. Violet, trembling, said she had been in the conservatory, tending to a potted fern, a curious activity, Miss Marple thought, for so late an hour. Captain Trent had been in the billiard room, practicing shots alone, while Dr. Whittaker said he had checked on Clara after dinner, finding her resting comfortably before returning to the drawing room. Miss Marple noted the times carefully. Clara's first symptoms at 9:15 p.m., Reginald's absence from 9:30 to 9:45 p.m., the scream at 10 p.m., and the vial's placement suggested someone had been in Clara's room after dinner. She recalled a case in Street, Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had been found under a rug, deliberately placed to incriminate another. The vial, she suspected, might serve a similar purpose. As the inspector continued, Miss Marple slipped upstairs to Clara's bedroom, which had been sealed by the police but left unguarded. She moved quietly, her steps sought on the thick carpet. The room was as it had been the previous night, save for the absence of the vial, now in police custody. The locket still lay on the nightstand, its silver surface catching the dim light. She picked it up gently, noting its weight in the faint scratches around the clasp, as if it had been opened repeatedly. Inside was a photograph of a young man, handsome but unfamiliar, with a faint smile. The locket's presence puzzled her. Clara, a married woman, kept it close, yet it held no image of Reginald or their daughter, Lydia. A soft creak in the corridor made Miss Marple turn. Violet Harrow stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect anyone here," she stammered, twisting her handkerchief. "Nor I, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, setting the locket down. "I was just admiring this lovely piece. Do you know who the photograph is of?" Violet's eyes flickered to the locket, then away. I'm not sure. Clara always wore it. I thought it was a family heirloom." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. Violet's hesitation was telling, like the nervous fidgeting of young Miss Carter in Street, Mary Mead, who had known more about a theft than she admitted. "You were in the conservatory last night, I believe?" she asked gently. "It must be peaceful there, with the plants." Violet flushed. "Yes, I like the quiet. I was watering the ferns." "At 10 o'clock at night?" Miss Marble's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. Violet's hands twisted tighter. "I couldn't sleep. I often go there when I'm troubled." Miss Marple smiled, patting Violet's arm. "Of course, my dear. We all have our ways of finding peace." As Violet hurried away, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Inspector Crawley was concluding his questions. She caught the tail end of Captain Trent's statement. "I was alone in the billiard room, as I said. No one can vouch for me, but I've no reason to harm Clara. She's a sweet woman, far too good for this lot." His tone was jovial, but Miss Marple noted the edge in his words, particularly when he glanced at Reginald. After the inspector left to confer with his sergeant, Miss Marple approached Eleanor, who was arranging flowers in a vase, a nervous habit Miss Marple knew from their years of friendship. "Eleanor, tell me about this locket Clara wears." Violet seemed uneasy about it. Eleanor frowned, her hands pausing. "I've seen it before, but Clara never spoke of it. I assumed it was a gift from Reginald when they were younger, though, well, their marriage hasn't been worn for years." There was talk, long ago, of Clara having a suitor before Reginald a soldier, I think, who died in the war. But that's ancient history. History, my dear Eleanor, has a way of lingering, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. She recalled a village widow who kept a locket with her late husband's picture, a source of comfort but also of gossip when it was stolen. The locket in Clara's room felt significant, perhaps a clue to motive. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple took a turn in the garden, her shawl drawn tight against the damp air. The gravel paths were lined with rose bushes, their blooms fading in the late summer chill. Near the conservatory, she paused, noting a small shed half hidden by ivy. Curious, she peered inside and found gardening tools, bags of fertilizer in a small, dusty bottle labeled arsenic, for pest control. It was stoppered and appeared untouched, but its presence was a thread in the pattern, one she tucked away for later. Returning to the house, she overheard raised voices from the library. Reginald and Lydia were arguing, their words sharp but muffled. You never cared for her, Lydia hissed. All you care about is the money. Lydia, that's enough, Reginald snapped. You don't understand the half of it. Miss Marple retreated before they noticed her, but the exchange confirmed her suspicions. Money, as so often in Street Mary Mead, was at the heart of the family's discord. She resolved to speak with Lydia, whose anger might reveal more than she intended. As luncheon approached, the household gathered once more, their faces drawn with fatigue and fear. Clara's fate hung over them, and the question of who had poisoned her remained unanswered. Miss Marple, however, felt the first stirrings of clarity, like the moment in a knitting pattern when the shape begins to emerge. The locket, the vial, the arsenic in the shed, the strained alibis all were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. Chapter 4. The Art of Asking Questions. The luncheon at Blackthorn Hall was a strained affair, the clink of cutlery against fine china sounding unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The long dining table, set with crisp linens and silver, seemed to magnify the distance between the guests, each of whom avoided the other's eyes. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the end beside Eleanor Grayson, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her knitting tucked away for now, but her mind was as busy as ever, weaving together the threads of the morning's discoveries, the locket, the arsenic in the shed, and the heated words between Reginald and Lydia. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, maintained her composure, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped her fork. We must carry on as normally as possible, she declared, her voice firm but brittle. Clara is in good hands, and the police will handle this unpleasantness. Unpleasantness? Lydia Ashbourne snapped, her dark eyes flashing. Someone tried to kill Mother, and you call it unpleasantness? Honestly, Grandmother, you act as if it's a spilled teacup. Lydia, mind your tone, Beatrice retorted, but her gaze softened slightly, betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted it, recalling Thomas's Bantry in Street. Mary Mead had once tried to dismiss a scandal with similar bravado, only to crumble when pressed. Reginald, who had joined the meal late, pushed his plate away untouched. Lydia, enough. We're all upset, but hysterics won't help. Hysterics. Lydia's voice rose, and she stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You'd like that, wouldn't you? To paint me as the irrational one while she stopped abruptly, her lips pressing into a thin line, then stormed out of the room. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the tremor in her hands. Lydia's anger was genuine, but there was something else, fear, perhaps, or guilt. She made a mental note to seek the girl out later, perhaps in the garden, where young people often felt less guarded. Captain Marcus Trent broke the awkward silence with a forced chuckle. Young Lydia's always been a firebrand. Takes after her father, I'd say. His tone was jovial, but his eyes lingered on Reginald, sharp and assessing. Dear. Henry Whittaker, seated across from Miss Marple, cleared his throat. She's frightened, that's all. This is a shock to everyone. I spoke to the hospital this morning. Clara's condition is improving, but she's not yet awake. The next 24 hours are critical. Thank you, Henry, Beatrice said, her voice softening. Your care has been invaluable. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind turning to deeper Whitaker's role. His quick action had saved Clara, but his intimate knowledge of her health and access to her room made him a figure worth watching. In Street Mary Mead, she had known a doctor who dispensed more than medicine, his prescriptions masking darker intentions. She resolved to learn more about Dr. Whitaker's history with the family. After luncheon, as the others dispersed, Miss Marple approached Violet Harrell, who was lingering near the French doors leading to the terrace. The young woman's nervous demeanor was more pronounced today, her fingers twisting her handkerchief into knots. Miss Harrell, Miss Marple said gently, might I have a word? The gardens look so inviting, and I could use a companion for a stroll. Violet hesitated, then nodded, her eyes wary. They stepped onto the terrace, the air cool and scented with late roses. Miss Marple walked slowly, her pace deliberate, allowing Violet to relax. You seem troubled, my dear, she began. It's only natural, with such a dreadful event. But I find that talking often helps. Violet's shoulders tensed. There's nothing to say, Miss Marple. I don't know anything about what happened to Clara. Of course, Miss Marple said soothingly. But you were fond of her, weren't you? I noticed how you looked at her during dinner so concerned. Violet's eyes filled with tears. She's been kind to me. Ever since I came to Blackthorn Hall, she's treated me like a sister. Not everyone here does. Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the house, as if fearing eavesdroppers. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind sharp. It must be difficult, being a ward in such a grand family. I imagine Clara's kindness meant a great deal. Did you ever talk about her locket? It's such a pretty thing. Violet's face paled, and she stopped walking. The locket? I told you, I don't know much about it. She always wore it, that's all. But you recognized the photograph inside, didn't you? Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost conversational, but her eyes held Violet's, steady and searching. Violet's hands trembled, and she looked away. It's private. I shouldn't say. Clara wouldn't want me to. Of course, my dear, Miss Marple said, patting her arm. But secrets have a way of weighing heavily, don't they? In my village, I once knew a girl who kept a secret for a friend, and it nearly broke her. If you ever feel the need to unburden yourself, I'm here. Violet nodded mutely and hurried back to the house, leaving Miss Marple alone on the path. The old lady's lips curved slightly. Violet knew more than she was saying, and her fears suggested a loyalty or a threat. The locket, Miss Marple was certain, was a key, perhaps to a past that someone wished to keep buried. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Crawley, who was in the library, reviewing notes with his sergeant. Inspector, she said, her voice deferential, I wonder if I might ask about the wine glass from last night. The one Clara dropped. Has it been examined? Crawley frowned, clearly unused to interference from elderly ladies. It's been collected for analysis, Miss Marple. Why do you ask? Oh, just a thought, she said lightly. In my village, we once had a case where a spilled drink hid a clue. The rock where it fell, has it been checked? Wine stains can be deceptive. Crawley's expression softened slightly, though he remained skeptical. We'll look into it. But the vial in Clara's room is our focus. Whoever placed it there is our culprit. Miss Marple nodded, her face serene. She did not argue, but she knew the vial was too obvious, like a clue planted in a village mystery to mislead the unwary. The wine glass, or perhaps the decanter from which it was poured, held more promise. Later, she found Lydia in the conservatory, surrounded by ferns and orchids. The girl was staring at a wilted plant, her expression stormy. Miss Marple, she said, startled. What are you doing here? Just admiring the greenery, Miss Marple replied, settling onto a wicker bench. You seem fond of this place, like Violet. It's peaceful, isn't it? Lydia shrugged, her guard up. It's better than the house. Too many lies there. Lies are heavy things, Miss Marple said softly. I heard you arguing with your father earlier. It sounded as if you feel he's wronged your mother. Lydia's eyes flashed. He's never cared about her. All he cares about is the estate, the money. He's been selling off land, to cover his debts. Mother's been miserable for years, and now this her voice broke, and she turned away. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. It must be hard, seeing your mother suffer. Did she ever speak of her locket? It seems important to her. Lydia hesitated, then shook her head. She never talked about it. But she always wore it, even when father mocked her for it. Said it was sentimental nonsense. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Reginald's scorn suggested he knew the locket's significance or resented it. She thanked Lydia and left her to her thoughts, her mind turning to the next thread, the arsenic in the shed. It was too convenient, like a stage prop, but she needed to know who had access to it. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple felt the puzzle taking shape. The locket, the wine, the arsenic, the family's secrets all were connected, and the truth lay in their intersections. She recalled the street, Mead poisoning where the motive had been love, twisted by jealousy. Here, too, she sensed a personal motive, one that Clara's locket might unlock. With a quiet resolve, she decided to examine the dining room again, where the first act of this drama had begun. Chapter 5. The red herrings. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Hall's dining room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Miss Jane Marple stood alone in the room, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the space. The remnants of the previous night's dinner had been cleared, but the faint stain on the rug where Clara's wineglass had shattered remained, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and clear despite her age, lingered on the spot. She had seen many such stains in her time, tea spilled in a street, Mead parlor, ink blotted on a vicar's desk, each telling a story if one knew how to read it. Her conversation with Lydia had confirmed her suspicion that the locket was a thread worth pulling, but the wineglass intrigued her more. The poison, Dr. Whittaker had said, was likely administered within an hour of Clara's collapse at 10 p.m., dropped at 9:15 p.m. Was too early for arsenic to act so swiftly, unless the dose was exceptionally potent. Yet the vial in Clara's room suggested a later administration. Miss Marple frowned, her mind sifting through possibilities. In her village, a poisoning case had hinged on a misjudged timing, the maid's tea tray delivered at the wrong hour. Here, the timeline was a puzzle, and she suspected the wineglass was a distraction, a red herring meant to mislead. She knelt carefully, examining the rug. The stain was faint, barely noticeable against the deep burgundy weave, but she detected a slight irregularity, a crystalline residue, perhaps where the wine had dried. She made a mental note to ask Inspector Crawley if the glass had been tested for more than wine. The decanter, too, warranted scrutiny. It had been shared by all at dinner, yet only Clara had fallen ill. A selective poison, then, or a sleight of hand? Footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she rose to find Captain Marcus Trent entering the room, a cigar in hand. His hearty demeanor was subdued, his eyes wary as they met hers. Miss Marple, poking about. Are you? He said, forcing a smile. You'll have the inspector thinking you're after his job. Oh, hardly, Captain, she replied, her tone light. I'm merely an old woman with a habit of noticing things. The rug, for instance, is such a pity to see it stained. That wineglass falling was so unfortunate. Trent's smile faltered. Clumsy of Clara, I suppose. Nerves, perhaps. She's always been delicate. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her eyes gentle but probing. You were in the billiard room after dinner, I believe. It must be a fine place to think, all alone. Trent puffed his cigar, the smoke curling upward. It is. I like a bit of quiet after a meal. Nothing sinister in that, I hope. His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened on the cigar. Of course not, she said. Though it's curious, isn't it, how everyone was so scattered after dinner. You in the billiard room, Reginald in the library, Violet in the conservatory. Almost as if no one wanted to be seen together. Trent's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly. Families, you know. Always a bit of friction. Nothing to do with Clara's trouble, I'm sure. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. She let him go, but his unease lingered in her mind. Captain Trent's bluff charm reminded her of a retired colonel in Street, Mead, whose hearty tales had a gambling debt that led to blackmail. Trent's financial reliance on Lady Beatrice, mentioned by Eleanor, was a motive worth exploring. She made her way to the drawing room, where Inspector Crawley was conferring with his sergeant over a map of the house. The inspector looked up, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. Miss Marple, you're everywhere today. Found any more stains to fuss over? Only my curiosity, Inspector, she said with a smile. I was wondering about the decanter from last night. Was it tested along with the glass? Crawley sighed, flipping through his notebook. The decanter's clean, as far as we can tell. The lab's still working on the glass, but the vial's the key. Arsenic, pure and simple, found right by Clara's bed. Someone slipped it to her after dinner. After dinner, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yet she felt ill during the meal. It's puzzling, isn't it? Almost as if the poison was meant to be found in one place, but administered in another. Crawley frowned, clearly unaccustomed to such musings from civilians. You're suggesting someone planted the vial to throw us off? Oh, I wouldn't presume to suggest, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. But in my village, we once had a theft where a stolen ring was left in plain sight to implicate the wrong person. The obvious clue is often the least reliable. The inspector grunted, but she saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. She excused herself and sought out Eleanor, who was in the morning room, arranging papers with a distracted air. Eleanor, my dear, Miss Marple said, settling beside her, tell me about Captain Trent. He seems a cheerful sort, but I gather he's had financial troubles. Eleanor glanced at the door, lowering her voice. Marcus has always been a spendthrift. Beatrice has bailed him out more times than I can count loans for his investments, which never seem to pan out. Clara used to pity him, but Reginald's fed up. There was a row about it last month. Reginald threatened to cut him off. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. A man in debt was a man under pressure, and pressure could lead to desperate acts. She recalled a street, Mead grocer who, pressed by creditors, had tampered with a rival stock. Trent's solitary billiard game seemed less innocent now as evening approached. Miss Marple visited the conservatory, hoping to find Violet or Lydia, but instead encountered Dr. Whittaker, inspecting a row of orchids. His presence surprised her, but she greeted him warmly. Dr. Whittaker, you have an interest in botany, I see. The conservatory is quite a haven. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. A hobby, Miss Marple. Plants are simpler than people, predictable, if you know their needs. Unlike families, she said lightly. Clara's illness must be a strain on you, being so close to the Ashbournes. His expression tightened. I've known them for years. Clara's health has always been fragile, but this is monstrous. Indeed, Miss Marple said. You checked on her after dinner, didn't you? Before the scream. Was she alone then? Dr. Whittaker hesitated, his fingers pausing on an orchid leaf. Yes, she was resting. I saw nothing amiss, just her usual medications on the nightstand. And the locket? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Did you notice it? He shook his head, too quickly, she thought. I didn't pay attention to it. I was concerned with her pulse, her breathing. Miss Marple smiled, thanking him, but her mind was alert. Dr. Whittaker's calm efficiency was admirable, but his reluctance to discuss the locket mirrored Violet's. She wondered if his devotion to Clara went beyond professional duty, recalling a Street, Mead nurse whose care for a patient had masked a deeper attachment. As she returned to the house, Miss Marple felt the web of deception tightening. The vial was too obvious, the wine glass too early, the locket too personal. Someone had crafted a narrative to mislead, scattering red herrings to obscure the truth. But Miss Marple, with her village-honed instincts, knew that truth lay in the details, the glance, the pause, the misplaced object. She would need to tread carefully, for the poisoner was still among them, watching and waiting. Chapter 6. A clue. In detail. The evening settled over Blackthorn Hall like a heavy curtain, the lamps casting soft pools of light that did little to dispel the chill of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the gathered household. The tension was palpable, a silent current running beneath the forced civility. Lady Beatrice maintained her regal poise, though her eyes betrayed a weariness Miss Marple recognized from countless village dramas, a matriarch struggling to hold a fracturing family together. Reginald, nursing a brandy, stared into the fire, his face drawn. Lydia had not reappeared since luncheon, and Violet's nervous fidgeting had grown more pronounced, her handkerchief now a tattered knot. Captain Trent, meanwhile, paced near the window, his usual bluster subdued, while Dr. Whittaker sat quietly, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's mind was occupied with the details of the case, each a thread in the intricate pattern she was beginning to discern. The locket, with its mysterious photograph, suggested a personal motive, perhaps tied to Clara's past. The arsenic in the shed was too convenient, a clue planted to mislead, much like the vial in Clara's room. The wine glass, however, nagged at her. Its residue, which she had noted earlier, hinted at something more than wine, but Inspector Crawley's focus remained stubbornly on the vial. She recalled a street, Mead incident where a poisoned cake had been overlooked because of a more obvious clue, a forged letter. Here, too, the truth lay in what was ignored. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Crawley, who entered with a purposeful stride, his notebook in hand. "I've had a report from the lab," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The wine glass from last night contained traces of arsenic, though not enough to kill. The vial in Mrs. Ashbourne's room, however, had a lethal dose. It seems the poison was administered in 2 stages, first a small amount in the wine, then a larger dose later. The room stirred, gasps and murmurs rippling through the group. Lady Beatrice's face tightened. 2 doses? That's preposterous. Who would be so methodical? Someone clever, Crawley replied, his eyes sweeping the room. Someone who wanted to ensure Mrs. Ashbourne's death, but make it look like a single act. I'll need to re-interview everyone about their movements between 9:15 p.m., when the glass was dropped, and 10 p.m., when the scream was heard. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. 2 doses explained the timeline: Clara's initial illness at dinner, followed by her collapse later. The wine glass was a subtle touch, meant to sicken but not kill, perhaps to create confusion. The vial, then, was a true weapon, placed in Clara's room to point to a later, more deliberate act. It was a clever ruse, like a village gossip spreading half-truths to obscure a scandal. But who had the opportunity and the nerve to execute such a plan? As Crawley began questioning, Miss Marple slipped away, her destination the kitchen. The servants, she knew, were often the unseen eyes of a household, privy to details the family overlooked. The kitchen was bustling, with the cook, Mrs. Hargreaves, directing 2 maids as they prepared tea. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, her manner disarming. "Such a lovely tea service last night," she said, settling at the scrubbed oak table. "I couldn't help but notice the wine decanter. It was shared by all, wasn't it?" Mrs. Hargreaves, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, nodded. "Aye, miss. The Bordeaux was poured from 1 decanter, same as always. I filled it myself from the cellar before dinner." "And who served it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "That'd be Jenny," Mrs. Hargreaves said, nodding to a young maid who was polishing silver. "She poured for everyone at the table." Jenny, a slight girl with white eyes, blushed under Miss Marple's gaze. "I did, ma'am. I poured for Mrs. Ashbourne first, as Lady Beatrice likes it. I didn't notice anything odd. Of course not, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. But tell me, did anyone handle the decanter after you poured? Or perhaps someone asked for a second glass? Jenny frowned, thinking. Mr. Reginald did ask for more wine, just before the dessert. I poured it from the decanter, same as the others. But, well, it's not my place to say, but he seemed a bit distracted, kept looking at Mrs. Ashbourne. Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. And the glasses? Were they cleared right away after Mrs. Ashbourne dropped hers? No, ma'am, Jenny said. It broke, and we left it till after dinner, what with the commotion. I swept it up later, before the police came. Miss Marple thanked them and left, her mind turning over Jenny's words. Reginald's distraction, his request for more wine, suggested he had been near the decanter at a critical moment. Yet the arsenic in the glass was a small dose, not lethal. Had he intended only to sicken Clara, or was he unaware of the poison? She recalled the street, Mead husband who had tampered with his wife's tonic, claiming it was a prank, only for it to mask a darker intent. Returning to the drawing room, she found Crawley questioning dear Whittaker, whose calm demeanor was unshaken. I was in the drawing room after checking on Clara at 9:30, he said. I joined Lady Beatrice and Mr. Ashbourne there until the scream. Then you saw nothing unusual in Mrs. Ashbourne's room? Crawley pressed nothing, Whittaker replied. She was resting, her medications on the nightstand. I didn't notice the vial. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The vial, again, was too convenient. Its placement suggested someone had entered Clara's room after Whittaker's visit but before the scream. She made a mental note to check the servants' staircase, which led directly to the upstairs bedrooms, a discreet route for someone wishing to avoid notice. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple approached Lady Beatrice, who was standing by the fireplace, her face a mask of controlled grief. Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple said softly, this must be a terrible strain. I couldn't help but notice Clara's locket last night. It's such a personal item. Do you know its history? Beatrice's lips thinned, but she answered evenly. It was a gift, I believe, from before her marriage. Clara was always sentimental about it, though Reginald disapproved. I never pried. Miss Marple nodded, sensing Beatrice's reluctance. The locket, she was certain, held a secret that tied to the motive. A past flaw, perhaps, as Eleanor had hinted, or something more dangerous, a secret someone feared Clara might reveal later. Miss Marple slipped upstairs to the servants' staircase, a narrow passage tucked behind a panel in the corridor. It was dimly lit, with worn steps that creaked underfoot. Near the top, she found a small scrap of fabric caught on a splinter of fine blue silk, not unlike the shawl Violet had worn at dinner. She tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing. Violet's nervous claim of being in the conservatory at 10 p.m. was now in question. Had she used the staircase to reach Clara's room unseen? As she returned to her room, Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. The arsenic in the wine glass was a feint, meant to draw attention from the vial. The locket pointed to a personal motive, perhaps jealousy or betrayal. And the scrap of silk suggested Violet's involvement, though whether as culprit or witness remained unclear. In Street Mead, a torn glove had once led to a thief's confession. Here, the silk might unravel a murderer's plan. Miss Marple resolved to speak with Violet again, gently pressing the girl's fragile nerves. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the details that others overlooked. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced the second day at Blackthorn Hall, dawned with oppressive stillness, as if the house itself were holding its secrets close. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a cup of tea, contemplated the scrap of blue silk she had found on the servants' staircase. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but in her experience, such trifles often held the key to unraveling a mystery. The silk matched Violet Harrow's shawl, and her nervous demeanor suggested she knew more than she had admitted. Yet Miss Marple was cautious. Accusations were like drop stitches, easily made but difficult to mend. She needed more threads to complete the pattern. Downstairs, the household was restless. Inspector Crawley's investigation had intensified, with constables combing the grounds and questioning the staff. The news of arsenic in the wine glass had shifted suspicion, casting a net over everyone who had been near the dining room. Miss Marple, however, suspected the wine glass was a distraction, a clever ploy to obscure the true method of poisoning. The vial in Clara's room, with its lethal dose, was the real weapon, and its placement pointed to someone with intimate access to her private space. At breakfast, the atmosphere was strained. Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, announced that Clara's condition had stabilized, though she remained unconscious. "The doctors are hopeful," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Reginald, seated beside her, stared at his plate, his hands restless. Lydia, who had rejoined the group, was silent, her earlier fire replaced by a sullen resignation. Violet avoided everyone's gaze, her fingers twisting a new handkerchief, while Captain Trent made a show of hearty appetite, though his jokes fell flat. Dr. Whittaker, ever calm, offered medical reassurances, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on the empty chair where Clara would have sat after breakfast. Miss Marple sought out Violet, finding her in the library, curled in an armchair with a book she wasn't reading. "Miss Harrel," Miss Marple said gently, settling opposite her, "you look troubled. I find the quiet chat often eases the mind. Would you care to walk with me?" Violet hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, but she nodded. They stepped into the garden, where the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Miss Marple chose a path near the conservatory, her pace slow and deliberate. "You were in the conservatory last night, you said," she began, her tone conversational. "It's a lovely spot, but rather dark at 10 o'clock. Did you use the servants' staircase to return to the house?" Violet's face paled, and her handkerchief twisted tighter. "The staircase? No, I came through the main hall." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just a fancy," Miss Marple said, producing the scrap of silk from her pocket. "I found this on the staircase. It's such a pretty shade, like your shawl. I thought perhaps you caught it there." Violet's breath caught, and she shook her head quickly. "It's not mine. I mean, it could be, but I wasn't there. I swear it, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled, tucking the silk away. "Of course, my dear. These things are easily lost. But you were fond of Clara, weren't you? Did she ever confide in you about her troubles? Her marriage, perhaps, or that locket she wore?" Violet's eyes filled with tears. She was unhappy. She never said much, but I could tell. Reginald was always angry, and Lydia, well, she blamed Clara for everything. The locket, she said it was from someone she loved long ago, someone who died. She wouldn't say more, but it made her sad. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but her mind sharp. Violet's admission confirmed Eleanor's hint about a past suitor, but the girl's fears suggested she knew something dangerous. "Thank you, Violet," she said softly. "You've been most helpful. If you remember anything else, you know where to find me." As Violet hurried away, Miss Marple made her way to the conservatory, where she had seen Dr. Whittaker the previous day. The glass-walled room was a jungle of green, with ferns and orchids thriving in the humid air. She examined the shelves, noting a small gardening log kept by Violet, its pages filled with neat entries about watering and pruning. One entry, dated 2 days ago, caught her eye: "Order new pest control for Rosa's arsenic-based, per Mr. Trent's suggestion." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Trent's involvement with the arsenic was a new thread, one that tied him to the shed where she had found the bottle. Returning to the house, she overheard another argument, this time between Reginald and Captain Trent, in the study. "You bled us dry, Marcus," Reginald was saying, his voice low but furious. "Mother's loans to you are ruining us. If Clara knew she doesn't, and you'd better keep it that way, Trent snapped. You're no saint yourself, Reginald. Those land sales weren't just to cover estate costs, were they? Miss Marple retreated before they noticed her, her mind racing. The financial strain Eleanor had mentioned was deeper than she realized, and Trent's veiled threats suggested he knew something compromising about Reginald. Money, she knew from Street Mary Mead, was a potent motive for murder, especially when paired with desperation. Later, she joined Eleanor for tea in the morning room, where she shared her findings. Eleanor, my dear, she said, stirring her tea, this family is tangled in secrets. Reginald's debts, Trent's borrowing, Clara's locket, they're all connected, I'm sure. But the arsenic in the wine glass puzzles me. It was too small a dose to kill, yet it drew attention to the dinner. Eleanor frowned. You think it was deliberate? To make us suspect the decanter? Precisely, Miss Marple said. It's like a village trick spill, a bait of gossip to distract from the real scandal. The vial in Clara's room was meant to be found, but the wine glass was a flourish, to confuse us. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Crawley, who entered with a grave expression. Miss Marple, Mrs. Grayson, I'm news. The lab confirmed the wine glass held a trace of arsenic, but the decanter was clean. Someone tampered with Clara's glass alone, likely during dinner. And we found something else, a ledger in Mr. Ashbourne's study, showing large payments to Captain Trent, marked as loans. Reginald, who had just entered, overheard and flushed. Those are private matters, Inspector. They've nothing to do with Clara. We'll see about that, Crawley said, his tone sharp. Money's a powerful motive, Mr. Ashbourne. Miss Marple watched Reginald's reaction, noting the sweat on his brow. The ledger confirmed the financial discord, but it also pointed to Trent as a potential blackmailer. She recalled a Street Mary Mead shopkeeper who had been driven to theft by a creditor's threats. Here, the stakes were higher, and the poisoner's motive was becoming clearer. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple felt the web of lies tightening. Violet's fear, Trent's threats, Reginald's debts, and the locket's secret were all threads, but the pattern was incomplete. The arsenic in the wine glass was a deliberate misdirection, but the vial's placement suggested a colder, more calculated mind. She resolved to press Violet further and to examine the ledger herself, if possible. In Street Mary Mead, a hidden account book had once revealed the motive for murder. Here, she suspected, the truth lay in the numbers and the hearts of Blackthorn Hall's inhabitants. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. The third morning at Blackthorn Hall was cloaked in a fine drizzle, the kind that seeped into one's bones and sharpened the edges of unease. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm as she listened to the muted sounds of the household. The tension had grown almost tangible, like the damp air outside, and the family's polite facades were beginning to crack. Inspector Crawley's discovery of the ledger had stirred the pot, and Miss Marple sensed that the truth, like a long-buried seed, was ready to break through the surface. Her thoughts returned to Violet Harrell. The girl's fear, coupled with the scrap of blue silk and her vague answers about the locket, suggested she held a piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple recalled the Street Mary Mead girl, young Elsie, who had wept over a stolen letter, her tears revealing a truth she couldn't voice. Violet, she suspected, was close to a similar breaking point. The ledger, too, was significant. Reginald's payments to Captain Trent hinted at blackmail or desperation, motives that could drive a man to poison. Yet Clara Sabrina, the question remained, who had the means, the opportunity, and the heart to harm Clara? After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out Violet, finding her in the conservatory, her hands busy with a pair of pruning shears but her eyes distant. Good morning, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, settling onto a bench. You seem fond of this place. It's so peaceful. Violet started, nearly dropping the shears. Oh, Miss Marple. I didn't hear you come in. No matter, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. I find gardening so soothing, though I confess I'm no expert. You seem to have a gift for it. Violet managed a small smile, but her hands trembled. It's just something to do. keeps my mind off things. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly. Things like Clara's illness, I suppose. It must weigh heavily on you. You're close to her, aren't you? Violet's eyes filled with tears, and she set the shears down. She's been so kind to me. When I came here, after my parents died, I felt so alone. Clara made me feel wanted. And now, her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. Miss Marple moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. There, my dear. It's a dreadful thing, but Clara is strong. She's fighting, thanks to dear Whittaker. But I wonder, did she ever share anything with you that might explain this? Something about her locket, perhaps? Violet's sobs grew quieter, but her shoulders shook. She told me once it was from someone she loved, a long time ago. A soldier who died. She said it was her greatest regret, losing him. Reginald hated it. He said it made her look foolish, clinging to the past. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. That must have been painful for her. Did anyone else know about it? Violet hesitated, wiping her eyes. I think dear Whittaker knew. He was always so gentle with her, asking about her health, her moods. I saw him looking at the locket once, when he thought no one was watching. It was strange. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Dear Whittaker's interest in the locket was a new thread, one that suggested a deeper connection to Clara. You've been very brave, Violet, she said. If you ever feel ready to share more, I'm here. Sometimes, the smallest things can make a difference. Violet nodded, her lips trembling, and Miss Marple left her to her thoughts. The girl was on the edge of breaking, and a gentle push might reveal more. But for now, Miss Marple turned her attention to the ledger, which Inspector Crawley had mentioned. She found him in the library, poring over his notes. Inspector, she said, her tone deferential. I wonder if I might ask about that ledger you found. It seems to have caused quite a stir. Crawley sighed, clearly weary of her interference. It's evidence, Miss Marple. Mr. Ashbourne was paying large sums to Captain Trent over the years. Looks like blackmail to me, or something close to it. Dear me, Miss Marple said, her eyes wide with faint surprise. And these payments, were they recent? Some were, Crawley said. The latest was a month ago, a hefty one. Mr. Ashbourne claims it was a loan, but it's suspicious, given the timing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Blackmail was a powerful motive, and Trent's financial dependence on the family made him a prime suspect. Yet Deacon Whittaker's behavior, Violet's fear, and Reginald's distress suggested multiple currents running beneath the surface. She recalled the street, Mary Mead case where a blackmailer had been poisoned to silence him here. The stakes were higher, and the poisoner's target was Clara. Later, she joined Eleanor for tea in the drawing room, where the conversation turned to the family's past. Eleanor, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea, you mentioned Clara's suitor, the soldier. Was there ever talk of impropriety? Something that might have lingered? Eleanor frowned, her voice low. There was gossip, years ago, that Clara was too close to him before her marriage to Reginald. He was a local man, a hero, but he died in the war. Some said Clara never got over it, and Reginald was jealous. Deacon Whittaker was their friend. You know he might have known him, too. Miss Marple's needles paused. Dear Whittaker, again. His connection to Clara's past, his interest in the locket, and his access to her room made him a figure of interest. She recalled a village doctor who had harbored a secret love for a patient, his actions driven by unspoken longing. Was Whittaker's devotion to Clara more than professional? As evening fell, Violet appeared in the drawing room, her face pale and her eyes red. She approached Miss Marple, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple, I need to tell you something. I saw something that night, before the scream. I was on the servants' staircase. I dropped my shawl. I think I saw someone coming out of Clara's room. It was dark, but I think it was dear Whittaker. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. "Thank you, Violet. That was very brave of you. Did you tell the inspector?" Violet shook her head. "I was afraid. He's been so kind, but it didn't look right." He was holding something small, like a bottle. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. Violet's revelation was the turning point she had been waiting for, a crack in the facade, revealing a truth that someone had tried to hide. Dr. Whittaker, with his access to poisons and his intimate knowledge of Clara, had the means and opportunity. But the motive remained elusive, tied, perhaps, to the locket and the past that refused to stay buried. Chapter 9. The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain by the afternoon of the third day at Blackthorn Hall, drumming against the windows and casting a grey pall over the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing down, as if the weather itself were conspiring to keep the household confined. Violet's revelation about Dr. Whittaker had shifted the pattern in Miss Marple's mind, like a skein of wool unraveling to reveal a hidden thread. The doctor's presence in Clara's room, holding a small bottle, was a damning detail, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. In Street Mary Mead, she had once misjudged Gardner's furtive behavior, only to learn he was hiding a gift, not a crime. Here, she needed to test her suspicions carefully. The household was restless, the strain of Inspector Crawley's investigation fraying nerves. Lady Beatrice maintained her imperious calm, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. Reginald, pale and distracted, avoided conversation, while Lydia's sullen silence had given way to sharp glances, as if she were searching for someone to blame. Captain Trent's joviality had faded, replaced by a tense watchfulness, and Violet seemed on the verge of collapse, her eyes darting nervously whenever Dr. Whittaker entered the room. The doctor himself remained composed, his professional demeanor unshaken. Though Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw when Violet looked at him, she decided it was time to set a trap, not a dramatic confrontation, but a subtle pressure to force the truth into the open. In her village, she had once prompted a confession by casually mentioning a misplaced key in the presence of a thief. Watching their reaction betrayed them. Here, she would use the locket and Violet's testimony to stir the waters. After tea, Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Crawley in the library. He greeted her with his usual mix of impatience and curiosity, his notebook open on the desk. "Miss Marple, I hope this is important. We're close to an arrest, I think." "Oh, I'm sure you are, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "But I wondered if you'd considered the locket on Clara's nightstand. It seems such a personal item, and I've heard it holds a photograph of a man from her past, a soldier, perhaps. It might be worth asking the household about it, don't you think? In front of everyone, I mean." Crawley frowned, clearly skeptical. "A locket? You think it's tied to the poisoning?" "Perhaps not directly," Miss Marple said, "but secrets have a way of stirring things up. And I've heard something else. Violet saw someone leaving Clara's room just before the scream, holding a small bottle. She's too frightened to tell you herself, but she mentioned Dr. Whittaker." Crawley's eyes widened, and he scribbled a note. "That's significant, Miss Marple. Why didn't she come forward?" "She's young and scared," Miss Marple replied. "But if you gather everyone tonight and mention the locket and perhaps Violet's sighting, it might prompt a reaction. People reveal themselves when they're caught off guard." Crawley nodded, a grudging respect in his expression. "I'll do it. But you stay out of the way, Miss Marple. This could get messy." Miss Marple smiled demurely, her mind already anticipating the evening. She returned to the drawing-room, where Eleanor was arranging flowers, her hands unsteady. "Jane, you look like you're plotting something," Eleanor said, half joking, only thinking. "My dear," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking. "This house is full of secrets, and I believe we're about to see one come to light." At 8 o'clock, Inspector Crawley summoned the household to the drawing-room, his manner brisk and authoritative. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the faces of Lady Beatrice, Reginald, Lydia, Violet, Captain Trent, and dear Whittaker. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting in her lap, her eyes sharp. I called you here to clarify a few points, Crawley began, his voice firm. We know Mrs. Ashbourne was poisoned with arsenic, first in her wineglass a small dose, meant to sicken, and then with a lethal dose from the vial in her room. We've also found a ledger showing large payments from Mr. Ashbourne to Captain Trent, suggesting financial motives. But there's something else, a locket on Mrs. Ashbourne's nightstand, containing a photograph of a man, not her husband. Does anyone know about this? The room tensed. Reginald's face flushed, and he gripped the arm of his chair. That locket is nonsense, he snapped. Clara's sentimental, that's all. It's got nothing to do with this. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Reginald, control yourself. The locket was from her youth, before you. It's no secret. Miss Marple watched dear Whittaker, whose calm facade faltered for a moment, his hand twitching. Violet, meanwhile, shrank into her chair, her face pale. Crawley pressed on. There's more. One of you saw someone leaving Mrs. Ashbourne's room just before the scream, holding a small bottle. Miss Harrow, would you care to confirm this? Violet gasped, her eyes wide with panic. I didn't mean to, please. It's all right, Miss Harrow, Crawley said, his tone softer. Just tell us who you saw. Violet's voice trembled as she whispered, it was Deeper Whittaker. The room erupted. Deeper Whittaker stood, his face pale but composed. That's absurd, he said, his voice steady. I was in Clara's room earlier, checking her condition, but I left by 9:30. I had no bottle, and I certainly didn't poison her. Lydia leapt to her feet, her voice shrill. You're lying. You always been too close to Mother, always hovering. You knew about that locket, didn't you? You were jealous. Lydia, enough. Lady Beatrice snapped, but her voice shook. Reginald stared at Whittaker, his eyes dark with suspicion, while Captain Trent watched the scene with a curious intensity. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze moving from face to face. Whittaker's denial was calm, but his twitching hand betrayed him. Violet's fear was genuine, but her hesitation suggested she was holding something back. Lydia's outburst, meanwhile, revealed a deep-seated resentment, perhaps fueled by more than suspicion. The locket had stirred the room, just as Miss Marple had hoped, but the trap was not yet sprung. Crawley raised a hand for silence. Deeper Whittaker, you'll need to explain your movements more clearly. And Miss Harrow, if you're hiding anything, now's the time to speak. Violet burst into tears, her words tumbling out. I didn't want to say, but Clara told me the locket was from a man she loved, a soldier named James. She said dear Whittaker knew him, that he was there when James died. She was afraid someone would use it against her. Whittaker's face drained a color, and he sank back into his chair. That's not true, he stammered. I knew James, yes, but it was years ago. I had no reason to harm Clara. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Violet's confession had cracked the facade, revealing the connection between Whittaker, Clara, and the mysterious James. The trap had worked, but the truth was still veiled. She recalled a street, Marry Me widow whose past love had sparked a murder here. The locket was the key, and Whittaker's reaction suggested he knew more than he admitted. As the room dissolved into murmurs, Miss Marple knew the moment was near. The poisoner was among them, and the threads Violet's citing, the locket, the ledger were converging. She would need to watch closely, for the next move would be the killer's, and it would be desperate. Chapter 10. The reveal. The drawing room of Blackthorn Hall was charged with a brittle tension, the air thick with accusations and half-spoken truths. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the gathered household. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles still, her eyes sharp as she observed the aftermath of Violet's revelation. Deeper Whittaker's pale face and trembling hands betrayed a crack in his composure, while Violet's tear-streaked cheeks spoke of a burden partially lifted. Lydia's anger simmered, her gaze fixed on Whitaker, and Reginald's silence was heavy with unspoken guilt. Lady Beatrice, for once, seemed at a loss, her authority undermined by the weight of Violet's words. Captain Trent watched with a calculating glint, as if measuring his own position in the unfolding drama. Inspector Crawley stood at the center, his notebook open, his expression grim. "This changes things," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Duke Whitaker, you'll need to explain your connection to this James and why Miss Harrow saw you leaving Mrs. Ashbourne's room with a bottle. And Miss Harrow, if you're holding anything back, I suggest you speak now." Violet shook her head, her voice barely audible. "That's all I know, I swear." Clara was afraid, but she wouldn't say why. "I didn't want to betray her." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the threads. The locket with James's photograph, Violet's sighting of Whitaker, the arsenic in the wineglass and vial, the ledger of payments to Trent. The pattern was nearly complete, but one detail eluded her, the motive that tied it all together. She recalled the street, Mead poisoning, where the killer's motive was not greed or hatred, but a twisted desire to protect a secret. Here, she sensed a similar complexity, rooted in Clara's past and the locket's significance. She rose, her small figure drawing little attention until she spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Inspector, if I may, I believe we are close to the truth. But to find it, we must look at the whole picture, not just the pieces. May I ask everyone a question?" Crawley hesitated, then nodded, his curiosity outweighing his irritation. "Go on, Miss Marple, but make it quick." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes moving from face to face. "Thank you. I've been thinking about Clara's locket, which seems to hold such importance. Violet tells us it contained the photograph of James, a soldier from Clara's past. Dear Whitaker, you knew him, didn't you? And you, Lady Beatrice, were aware of Clara's attachment to him. What I wonder is why would someone use that locket to harm her now, after all these years?" Duke Whitaker's hands clenched, but he remained silent. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, and she said, "It's an old story, Miss Marple. Clara was young, foolish. James died in the war, and she married Reginald. The locket is a relic, nothing more." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "But relics can stir deep feelings, jealousy, regret, even fear. The arsenic in Clara's wineglass was a small dose, meant to sicken, not kill. The vial in her room, however, was lethal. It's as if someone wanted us to focus on the wine, to miss the real act. And then there's the ledger, showing payments from Reginald to Captain Trent. Money, law, secrets all woven together." Reginald stirred, his voice hoarse. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I loved Clara. I never hurt her." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were precise. "I believe you, Mr. Ashbourne. But love can be complicated, can't it? In my village, I once knew a man who hid his wife's letters, thinking to protect her, but it only caused pain. Let us consider the facts. The wineglass was tampered with during dinner, when everyone was present. The vial was placed in Clara's room later. Between 9:15 and 10 p.m. Violet saw Dear Whitaker leaving her room, holding a bottle. And the locket, why was it left open, as if to draw attention? Whitaker stood, his face flushed. "I've told you, I didn't poison Clara. I checked on her at 9:30, as her doctor. The bottle Violet saw was her medication laudanum, for her nerves. I left it on her nightstand." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Laudanum, you say? Yet the vial found was arsenic. And the locket, was it open when you were there?" Whitaker hesitated, his eyes flickering. I don't recall. I was focused on Clara." Miss Marple turned to Violet, her voice gentle. "My dear, you said Clara was afraid. Did she ever mention Dr. Whitaker in connection with James?" Violet's hands twisted, and she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. She said James didn't die in the war. She thought he was killed, here, at Blackthorn Hall. She was afraid, dear. Whitaker knew something, because he was there when it happened. The room froze. Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Reginald's glass slipped, shattering on the floor. Trent's eyes widened, and Lydia stared at Violet, her face pale. Whitaker's composure shattered, and he sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but relentless. Let us suppose a story. Many years ago, Clara loved James, a soldier. He came to Blackthorn Hall, perhaps to see her, but something went wrong. An accident or something darker. Dear Whitaker, you were here then, weren't you? As a young doctor, perhaps a friend of the family. Did you see what happened to James? Whitaker's voice was hoarse. It was an accident. He fell in the garden shed. We were drinking, arguing about Clara. He was drunk, he stumbled. I tried to help, but he was gone. I told Clara it was the war, to spare her. And the locket? Miss Marple pressed. She kept it, a reminder of her guilt, her loss. But you feared she'd uncover the truth, didn't you? That James's death wasn't an accident, but a moment of rage, perhaps jealousy. Whitaker shook his head, but his eyes were haunted. No, I love her. I never hurt her. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were firm. Love can lead to terrible things. You poisoned the wineglass to sicken her, to keep her quiet, perhaps to scare her into silence. But when that failed, you placed the vial in her room, a lethal dose, to ensure her death. The locket was your mistake. You opened it, perhaps to remind her of James, to torment her. But Violet saw you, and the truth began to unravel. Crawley stepped forward, his face grim. Dear Whitaker, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Clara Ashbourne. Whitaker's shoulders slumped, and he nodded, his voice broken. I didn't want her to die. I couldn't let her dig up the past. James's death was an accident, but she was asking questions, talking to Violet. I panicked. The room was silent, save for Lydia's stifled sob. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting resumed, her heart heavy but satisfied. The truth had emerged, as it always did, from the small details: the locket, the silk, the bottle. In Street Mary Mead, she had seen love turn to poison before, and here, at Blackthorn Hall, the pattern was the same, only grander, darker. Chapter 11. The reflection. The rain had ceased, leaving Blackthorn Hall shrouded in a damp, quiet aftermath, as if the house itself were exhaling after the storm of revelation. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The arrest of Dr. Henry Whitaker had brought a somber clarity to the household, but it also left a residue of unease, like the faint mist that lingered on the lawns outside. Truth, Miss Marple knew, was a balm, but it could sting as much as it healed. The drawing-room confrontation had left the Ashbourne family shaken. Lady Beatrice, her imperious facade cracked, had retired to her room, claiming a headache but clearly grappling with the weight of Whitaker's confession. Reginald, his face grey with shock, had muttered something about checking on estate matters, though Miss Marple suspected he was avoiding the reality of his wife's near death. Lydia, her anger spent, had collapsed into tears, comforted by Violet, whose own relief was tempered by guilt for her role in exposing Whitaker. Captain Trent, uncharacteristically subdued, had offered to fetch a brandy for anyone who needed it, a gesture that went unanswered. Miss Marple sipped her tea, brought by a subdued Jenny, and reflected on the case. It had been, she thought, like one of her Street Mary Mead puzzles, where the smallest details, a glance, a torn scrap of fabric, a misplaced object revealed the heart of the matter. The locket, with its photograph of James, had been the key, stirring memories and fears that Whitaker could not bear to face. His love for Clara, twisted by guilt over James's death, had driven him to poison her, first to silence her questions, then to ensure her silence forever. The wineglass, with its trace of arsenic, was a misdirection, a desperate attempt to shift suspicion. But the vial in Clara's room had betrayed his intent. Eleanor Grayson joined her, settling into a chair with a sigh. Jane, I don't know how you do it, she said, her voice weary. You saw through it all, the locket, Whittaker, everything. I thought it was Reginald, or even Trent, with his debts. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. It's only a matter of observation, my dear Eleanor. People are much the same, whether in street, Merry Mead, or a grand house like this. They carry their secrets, their loves, their fears, and those show in the little things: a pause, a look, a locket worn too close to the heart. Eleanor shook her head. But Whittaker, he seemed so devoted to Clara. How could he do it? Love is a powerful thing, Miss Marple said softly, her needles clicking. But it can twist, like a vine that strangles the tree it clings to. In my village, I once knew a woman who poisoned her sister's tea, not out of hatred, but because she couldn't bear to lose her to another. Dear Whittaker loved Clara, but he feared her questions about James. His guilt made him desperate. Eleanor frowned. And James's death, was it really an accident, as he claimed? Miss Marple's lips pursed. That, we may never know. The truth of that night died with James, and Whittaker's confession gives us only his version. But Clara's fear, her locket, her questions, they suggest she suspected more. Perhaps that's why she kept the locket, as a reminder, or a warning. A soft knock interrupted them, and Violet entered, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, she said, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes, I wanted to thank you for listening, for helping me find the courage to speak. I was so afraid, but you made it possible. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and took Violet's hand. You were very brave, my dear. It's never easy to speak the truth, especially when it hurts those we care for. But you saved Clara, in a way, by telling what you saw. Violet's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. I hope she'll forgive me. I betrayed her confidence about James. She'll understand, Miss Marple said gently. In time, she'll see you acted out of love. As Violet left, Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. There's a lesson in this, Eleanor. Secrets, like wounds, fester when hidden. Clara's locket, Whittaker's guilt, Reginald's debts, they all grew in the dark. Truth, however painful, is the only way to heal. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. You sound like a philosopher, Jane. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Hardly. Just an old woman who's seen a great deal of human nature. Now, I think I'll take a turn in the garden before I leave. The roses will be lovely after the rain. She rose, gathering her shawl, and stepped outside. The air was fresh, the lawns glistening with moisture. As she walked the gravel paths, she thought of Clara, still in the hospital, fighting to recover. The locket, she suspected, would remain with her, a symbol of a love lost, but also of a life reclaimed. In street Merry Mead, Miss Marple had seen many such stories: love, loss, betrayal, redemption, and each left its mark, like a stitch in a tapestry. As she passed the conservatory, she saw Lydia sitting alone, her face softened by thought. Miss Marple paused, then continued, leaving the girl to her reflections. The Ashbournes would heal, in time, though the scars of this weekend would linger. For Miss Marple, it was time to return to street Merry Mead, to her quiet cottage in her own garden, where new stories, new patterns, would surely await. She boarded the evening train to street Merry Mead, her suitcase packed, her mind at ease. The mystery of Blackthorn Hall was solved, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet observation of human nature: the glances, the silences, the secrets that spoke louder than words. As the train rattled through the darkening countryside, Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles clicking once more, ready for the next puzzle life would bring. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The train to street Merry Mead had not yet departed when Miss Jane Marple, seated in her compartment with her knitting in her lap, felt a nagging unease. The case at Blackthorn Hall was solved, dear. Whittaker's confession tied the threads of the mystery into a neat knot. Yet, as the platform bustled outside, her mind lingered on the faces of the Ashbourne family: Lydia's tearful anger, Violet's fragile courage, Reginald's haunted silence. There was, she thought, a loose stitch in the pattern, a detail that whispered of unfinished business. In street Mead, she had learned to trust such instincts. Like the time a seemingly resolved theft had unraveled further when a second culprit emerged, she glanced at her watch 4:30 p.m. and made a sudden decision. The train could wait. She gathered her suitcase and returned to Blackthorn Hall, arriving as the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the estate. The house was quieter now, the frenetic energy of the investigation replaced by a heavy calm. Eleanor Grayson greeted her at the door, her face a mix of surprise and relief. "Jane, I thought you'd gone," Eleanor exclaimed, ushering her inside. "What brings you back?" "A small matter, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "I felt there was something left unsaid. May I speak with Lydia, if she's available?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "She's in the conservatory. She's been there most of the day, ever since, well, you know." Miss Marple found Lydia among the ferns, her dark hair falling over her face as she sat, staring at a wilted orchid. The girl looked up, startled, her eyes red but wary. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd left." "I had, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling onto a wicker chair. "But I couldn't help thinking about you. You've been through so much, and I wondered if there was anything you wished to share. Sometimes, after the truth comes out, other truths follow." Lydia's lips trembled, and she looked away. "What's there to say? Did Whitaker try to kill Mother?" "It's over." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to the girl's tension. "Perhaps. But I notice how deeply you feel things, Lydia. Your anger at your father, your love for your mother is also strong. In my village, I once knew a young girl who kept a secret to protect her family, but it only caused more pain. Is there something you're holding back?" Lydia's hands clenched, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she would remain silent. Then, in a rush, the words came. "I knew about James," she whispered. "Mother told me, years ago, that he didn't die in the war. She said he came to the hall, and something happened, something awful. She thought Father knew, too, and that's why they fought. I hated her for it, for keeping secrets, for making Father miserable. I put the arsenic in her wine glass." Miss Marple's needles paused, but her face remained calm. "The wine glass, not the vial?" Lydia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to kill her, I swear. I was so angry. I found the arsenic in the shed, and I thought a little would make her sick, make her stop hiding things. I didn't know about the vial, about dear Whitaker. I thought it was my fault when she collapsed." Miss Marple reached out, her hand gentle on Lydia's arm. "Oh, my dear, what a burden you carried. But you must tell the inspector. The truth, even when it hurts, is the only way to mend things." Lydia thought, but she nodded, her shoulders slumping with relief. Miss Marple guided her to the library, where Inspector Crawley was typing his notes. His eyebrows rose at their arrival, but he listened as Lydia, her voice halting, confessed to tampering with the wineglass. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she finished, her voice breaking. "I just wanted her to stop lying." Crawley's expression softened, though his tone was firm. "Miss Ashbourne, that was a reckless thing to do, but it explains the trace of arsenic in the glass. You're lucky it wasn't a lethal dose. I'll need a formal statement, and there may be consequences, but your honesty helps." Miss Marple watched as Lydia was led away, her heart heavy but satisfied. The wineglass had been a red herring, but not in the way she thought. Lydia's act of anger had unwittingly complicated Whitaker's plan, creating a dual poisoning that muddled the timeline. It was, she thought, like a street Mead scandal where two separate misdeeds had collided, each obscuring the other. As she prepared to leave once more, Lady Beatrice sought her out, her face lined with fatigue. "Miss Marple, I owe you a debt," she said, her voice low. "You've saved Clara and brought clarity to this wretched affair. But Lydia, will she be all right?" "In time, Miss Marple said gently. She acted out of pain, not malice. The truth will help her heal, as it will Clara. Your family has carried many secrets, Lady Beatrice. Perhaps now you can let them go. Beatrice nodded, her eyes glistening. You're right. Clara's locket, James's death, it's haunted us too long. I'll speak to her when she recovers, tell her everything. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting tucked into her bag. That's wise. In my village, I've seen how truth, however painful, sets people free. As she boarded the evening train at last, Miss Marple felt the loose stitch mended. Lydia's confession had completed the pattern, revealing a second layer to the crime: a daughter's anger, a doctor's guilt, a family's buried past. The locket, the arsenic, the ledger all had played their part, but it was the human heart, with its tangled loss and regrets, that had woven the mystery. As the train pulled away from Thornby, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes closing, her mind already turning to the quieter street, Merry Mead, where new stories, new patterns, would surely await. Chapter 13. The unraveling past the train to street, Merry Mead rattled through the dusk, its rhythm a counterpoint to Miss Jane Marble's thoughts. She had left Blackthorn Hall with the mystery resolved there. Whitaker's confession and Lydia's tearful admission had laid bare the motives and misdeeds that led to Clara's poisoning. Yet, as the countryside blurred past, Miss Marble's mind lingered on the locket and the shadow of James's death. There was, she felt, a final thread to be pulled, a piece of the past that might yet cast light on the present. In street Merry Mead, she had once uncovered a hidden will that explained a decades-old feud here. She suspected the truth about James held similar weight. Her decision to return to Blackthorn Hall had been impulsive, driven by Lydia's confession and the lingering question of James's fate. Had dear Whitaker told the full truth, or was there more to the story of that fateful night in the garden shed? Miss Marple resolved to visit Clara in the hospital, hoping the recovering woman might shed light on the locket's significance and the events that had haunted her family. She arrived in Thornby the next morning, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. The hospital, a small but modern facility on the edge of the village, was quiet, its corridors smelling of antiseptic and wax. Clara Ashbourne was in a private room, her face pale but alert, propped up by pillows. Her eyes widened at the sight of Miss Marple, and a faint smile crossed her lips. Miss Marple, she said, her voice weak but warm. I heard what you did, how you found the truth. I owe you my life. Miss Marple settled into a chair beside the bed, her knitting bag at her side. Nonsense, my dear. I only followed the threads others left tangled. I'm glad to see you recovering. How are you feeling? Clara's smile faded, her fingers brushing the locket that now hung around her neck, returned to her by the hospital staff. Better, though it's all a blur. The wine, the pain, and then waiting here. Lydia came yesterday, sobbing, saying she put arsenic in my glass. I couldn't believe it, my own daughter. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She was angry, hurt by secrets she didn't understand. But she loves you, Clara. She acted in a moment of passion, not malice. Dear Whitaker, however, had a darker intent. Clara's hand tightened on the locket, her eyes distant. Henry. I never thought he could do such a thing. He was always so kind, so attentive. But he knew about James, didn't he? Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. That's what I came to ask, my dear. Violet told me you suspected James didn't die in the war, that something happened here, at Blackthorn Hall. The locket holds his photograph, doesn't it? Can you tell me about him? Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. James was my first love. We were young, foolish, planning to marry after the war. But he came to the hall one night, just before he was to leave for the front. We argued. He wanted me to run away with him, but I was afraid. Father had arranged my marriage to Reginald, and I felt trapped. James left in a rage, and the next day, I was told he died in a fall, in the garden shed. Henry was there. He said it was an accident, that James was drunk. But I never believed it. I kept his locket, to remember him, to remind myself of what I lost. Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the pieces together. And you began to ask questions, didn't you? About James's death, about what really happened. Clara's lips trembled. Last month, I found an old letter in the library, hidden in a book. It was from James, written the day he died. He said he was going to confront Henry, that he suspected Henry loved me and would do anything to keep us apart. I showed it to Violet, asked her to keep it secret. I was going to ask Henry, but then, the poisoning. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained calm. The letter was a new thread, one that confirmed Whitaker's motive, a law twisted by jealousy, a secret he killed to protect. Did you tell anyone else about the letter? She asked. Only Violet, Clara said. But Reginald knew I was upset. He thought it was about the locket, about my clinging to the past. He was so angry, always jealous of James. Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her mind racing. The letter, hidden for years, had reignited old wounds, prompting Whitaker's desperate act. She recalled the street Mary Mead case where a hidden diary had revealed the murder's motive here. The letter was the catalyst, and Whitaker's fear of exposure had driven him to poison. Thank you, Clara, Miss Marple said. You've been very brave. Rest now, and let the truth heal your family. Leaving the hospital, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Crawley, who was at the local police station, finalizing his report. She shared Clara's story, emphasizing the letter and its implications. Crawley's eyes widened as he jotted down notes. That's motive, all right, he said. Whitaker's confession left out the letter. He claimed it was just guilt over James's fall. This changes things. I'll have the library search for it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. It's often the smallest things, Inspector, a letter, a locket, that reveal the heart of a crime. I trust you'll tie up the loose ends. As she boarded the train once more, Miss Marple felt the pattern complete. James's death, whether accident or murder, had cast a long shadow, and Whitaker's attempt to silence Clara had nearly destroyed the Ashbourne family. Lydia's confession, Violet's courage, and Clara's survival had brought the truth to light, healing the wound that James's loss had left. In Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such patterns before: love and secrets, betrayal and redemption, all woven into the fabric of human nature. As the train carried her home, she smiled, her knitting needles clicking, ready for the next mystery to unravel. Chapter 14. The ties that bind the train journey back to Street Mary Mead had given Miss Jane Marple time to reflect. But the quiet of her compartment was disrupted by a persistent thought: the Ashbourne family, though free from the shadow of dear Whitaker's crime, was still bound by the weight of their secrets. Clara's revelation about the letter and James's death had clarified the motive, but Miss Marple sensed that the healing of Blackthorn Hole was incomplete. Families, she knew from her Street Mary Mead days, were like tapestries, beautiful when whole, but prone to fraying under strain. A final visit, she decided, was necessary to ensure the threads were properly mended. She arrived at Blackthorn Hall the following morning, the air crisp and the lawns sparkling with dew under a pale sun. The house seemed less oppressive now, as if the truth had lifted a veil. Eleanor Grayson met her at the door, her face a mix of surprise and gratitude. Jane, you're back again. I swear, you're like a guardian angel. Clara's coming home tomorrow, and the house feels lighter, thanks to you. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. I'm no angel, Eleanor, just an old woman who dislikes loose ends. I'd like to speak with Lady Beatrice, if she's available. And perhaps Reginald and Lydia, together. Eleanor nodded, sensing the purpose in Miss Marple's tone. They're in the drawing room. It's been quiet since the inspector left, but there's still tension. Lydia's barely spoken to her father. Miss Marple found Lady Beatrice, Reginald, and Lydia in the drawing room, the fire casting a warm glow over the heavy furniture. Beatrice looked weary but resolute, her hands folded in her lap. Reginald stood by the window, his shoulders hunched, while Lydia sat apart, her eyes fixed on a book she wasn't reading. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Miss Marple knew this was the moment to weave the final stitches. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I hope you'll forgive my return." But I felt there was more to be said. Clara's recovery is a blessing, but families, I find, need more than truth to heal. They need understanding. Beatrice's lips tightened, but she nodded. "You've done us a great service, Miss Marple. What more do you wish to say?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. "In my village, I've seen families torn apart by secrets, but I've also seen them mend when they faced them together. Clara's locket, James's death, the letter they've cast a long shadow over you all. Lydia, your anger led you to a terrible act, but it came from love and pain. Reginald, your silence about James and your death has hurt Clara deeply. And Lady Beatrice, your strength has held this family together. But perhaps it's time to let go of control and let truth bind you." Lydia's head snapped up, her eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to hurt Mother. I was so angry at her, at Father, at everything. I thought if she was sick, she'd tell me the truth about James." Reginald turned from the window, his face etched with guilt. "Lydia, I failed you both. I knew Clara loved James, and I resented it. When she started asking about his death, I thought she was pulling away again. I didn't know about Whitaker, but I should have talked to her, not pushed her away." Beatrice's voice was sharp, but it trembled. "This family has carried too much silence. I knew about James's death. Henry told me it was an accident, and I believed him, for Clara's sake. I should have questioned it, but I wanted to protect her, to keep the family intact." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but firm. "Silence protects no one, Lady Beatrice. In Street, Mary Mead, I once knew a family who had a theft to spare a child's feelings, but it only bred mistrust. You must speak to Clara, all of you, when she returns. Tell her what you've told me, your regrets, your love. And Lydia, you must forgive yourself, as Clara will." Lydia's tears spilled over, and she nodded, her voice choked. "I will. I'll tell her everything." Reginald crossed the room, hesitating before placing a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Lydia. I've been a poor father. We'll do better, for your mother's sake." Beatrice rose, her composure faltering. "Miss Marple, you've seen through us all. I'll speak to Clara, tell her the truth about James, about my part in keeping it quiet. We owe her that." Miss Marple smiled, her needles stilling. "That's all I hoped for. Families are fragile, but they're strong when they face the truth together. Clara's locket, I think, will no longer be a symbol of loss, but of healing." As she left the drawing room, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The Ashbournes were not yet whole, but the path to reconciliation was open. She thought of Violet, whose courage had sparked the truth, and Captain Trent, whose role had been peripheral but whose deaths had added to the family's strain. The ledger, the locket, the arsenic, all were threads in a tapestry now mended, if not perfect. Outside, she took a final turn in the garden, the roses vibrant in the morning light. Eleanor joined her, her face brighter. "Jane, you worked a miracle. Clara's coming home, and the family, they're talking, really talking, for the first time in years." "It's no miracle, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Just human nature, laid bare. In Street, Mary Mead, I've seen it time and again. Truth is the needle that stitches wounds closed." As she boarded the train for Street, Mary Mead that afternoon, Miss Marple felt the case truly closed. The mystery of Blackthorn Hall had been more than a poisoning. It was a story of love, guilt, and redemption, woven through a family's heart. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, and she smiled, ready for the quiet of her cottage and the next puzzle life would bring. Chapter 15. The healing wound. The sun hung low over Blackthorn Hall as Miss Jane Marple's train pulled away from Thornby Station, its whistle a faint echo in the crisp autumn air. She had left the estate with a sense of completion, the tangled threads of the Ashbourne family's secrets now woven into a tapestry of truth. Yet, as the countryside rolled past her window, Miss Marple knew that true healing would come not from her efforts, but from the family's willingness to face their past. Her final visit, she hoped, would be a quiet coda to the drama, ensuring that Clara's return would mark a new beginning. In Street Mary Mead, she had seen families mend after betrayal slowly, painfully, but with a strength born of honesty. She trusted the Ashbournes would find the same. Back at Blackthorn Hall, the morning of Clara's return was marked by a tentative hope. The household gathered in the entrance hall, their faces a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Lady Beatrice stood at the center, her posture regal but softened by a rare vulnerability. Reginald, his usual restlessness subdued, held Lydia's hand, a gesture that spoke of a fragile truce. Violet, her nervous fidgeting replaced by a quiet resolve, stood beside Eleanor Grayson, who had stayed to support her cousin. Captain Trent lingered at the edges, his usual bluster absent, as if he sensed his place in the family was under scrutiny. Clara arrived by mid-morning, brought by a hospital car, her face pale but her eyes clear. The locket hung around her neck, its silver catching the light, no longer a symbol of hidden grief but a testament to survival. Lydia rushed forward, tears streaming, and embraced her mother, whispering apologies that Clara hushed with a gentle touch. "It's all right, darling," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. "We'll talk, all of us." Miss Marple, who had returned to the hall at Eleanor's insistence, stood quietly by the staircase, her knitting bag at her side. She had arrived early, wanting to witness the family's reunion and ensure the final stitches of her work held firm. Clara's eyes met hers, and she crossed the room, her steps slow but purposeful. "Miss Marple," she said, taking her hand, "Eleanor told me everything. Your clarity, your kindness is more than I can repay." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "My dear Clara, I only listened and watched, as I do in my village." The truth was there, waiting to be seen. "Your family has strength, and now, I think, the will to use it." Beatrice approached, her voice unusually soft. "Miss Marple, you've given us a chance to start again. I've kept too many secrets, thinking I was protecting us. I was wrong." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she drew out her knitting. "Secrets are heavy, Lady Beatrice. In Street Mary Mead, I've seen them tear families apart, but I've also seen truth bind them closer. You've taken the first step speaking to Clara, letting her know the full story of James." Clara's hand brushed the locket, her eyes distant but calm. "I spoke with Reginald and Lydia last night, by telephone. They told me everything: James's death, the letter, their regrets. It's painful, but it's a start. I want to believe Henry's story, that it was an accident, but I'll never know for certain. The locket is a reminder now, not just of loss, but of what we can overcome." Lydia, standing close, spoke up, her voice steadier than before. "I'm sorry, Mother. I was so angry, so confused. I'll make it right, I promise." Clara squeezed her hand, her smile warm. "You already are, Lydia. We'll learn together." Reginald cleared his throat, his face lined with emotion. "Miss Marple, you've shown us what we were too blind to see. I've been a fool, letting jealousy and debt drive a wedge between us. I'm selling some land properly, this time to settle things with Trent and start fresh." Captain Trent, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward, his expression sheepish. "I'm not being fair to you, Reginald. I took advantage, leaned too hard. I'll make my own way now, leave you be." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was sharp. "That's wise, Captain. Families thrive on trust, not obligation. In my village, a man once paid off a debt to save his name, but it was honesty that saved his soul." Violet, who had been silent, spoke up, her voice clear. "Miss Marple, you helped me find my courage. I was so afraid to speak, but you made it possible. I want to stay here, help Clara and Lydia, be part of this family." Clara smiled, pulling Violet into a gentle embrace. You already are, Violet. As the family moved to the drawing room, their voices softened now, filled with tentative plans for the future. Miss Marple slipped away, her work done. Eleanor followed her to the door, her eyes bright with gratitude. Jane, you've woven a miracle here. They're talking, planning, even laughing a little. It's a new beginning. No miracle, Eleanor, Miss Marple said, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Just human nature, laid bare. People want to heal, if given the chance. Now, I really must catch that train. As she walked to the station, the sun warming her back, Miss Marple thought of the locket, the letter, the arsenic, all symbols of a wound that had festered too long. The Ashbournes, like so many in Street Mary Mead, had been bound by love and torn by secrets, but truth had set them free. She boarded the train, her needles clicking once more, her heart light. Blackthorn Hall was behind her, but the world, she knew, was full of mysteries, and her quiet cottage in Street Mary Mead would always be a place where patterns waited to be unraveled.